Good morning, my dear students. Welcome once again to the Google Classroom of Sri Gokulam Public School. Let me begin today's class with a very beautiful quote by Roy T. Bennett. If you want to fly, you have to give up what weighs you down. A very wonderful quote which explains to us about how to handle sorrows and difficulties in our life. We know that often when we are pressurized with tensions or challenges or worries, we feel pulled down and unable to move on with life. But to keep moving forward and to live life to its fullest, we need to let go of what pulls us down. It could be a loss of someone, it could be some difficulties that we are facing, but whatever it may be, we need to be brave enough to let go of all the worries, tensions, pain that is there, and then we understand or we realize that there is a great healing happening inside us. We are transformed into something very different and more beautiful. The story that we are going to discuss today also speaks about a similar theme. It speaks about how to handle emotional pain and difficulties and the very important need of letting go of that pain. It's a very difficult task, but that is the only way how we can move forward in life. The story that we are going to discuss today is The Address. Marga Minko is the pen name of a Dutch writer, Sarah Minko. Sarah was a survivor of the Second World War. She had survived the brutal atrocities of the Nazi army by being in a hiding. Hence, most of her stories deal with the pain and the horrors faced by the survivors of Second World War. Our story, The Address, begins after the Holocaust when our narrator, a Jewish survivor who had lost her entire family, returns back to find her mother's belongings at the address Marconi Street, number 46. After ringing the doorbell, the narrator was given a cold reception by Mrs. Dorling. In fact, Mrs. Dorling held her hand at the door to show that the narrator is not welcomed inside. At a point, the narrator even felt that she had rung the wrong doorbell. But after few minutes, she recognized the lady at the door, that is Mrs. Dorling, wearing the green knitted cardigan. Cardigan means sweater. She was wearing the green knitted cardigan of her mother's. Mrs. Dorling also took some time to recognize the narrator. Once she had recognized the narrator, she was even more rude to her. She told the narrator that she had thought that all her family members had died in the Holocaust. Our narrator very coldly gives a reply that only she had survived the war. Again, Mrs. Dorling does not show any friendliness towards her and dismisses her by saying that she cannot help the narrator in any way. Narrator expresses her need to speak to Mrs. Dorling for a moment. But Mrs. Dorling very bluntly tells her that she is very busy and cannot speak to her. After that, she closes the door without even saying a proper farewell to the narrator. The narrator feels very disappointed and depressed. Before she leaves the house, she looks at the closed door and sees the nameplate Darling. At the jab of the door is the address number 46. As the narrator walked back to the train station, she recalled an incident of how once she had returned back to home from her university and noticed that most of her household items were missing. Her mother informed her that Mrs. Darling, an old acquaintance means a friend of hers, had renewed their friendship and insisted on keeping their things safe at Mrs. Darling's house. Her mother, who was a very innocent lady, did not suspect any ulterior motive behind Mrs. Darling's this suggestion. Ulterior means any hidden or secret motive. However, our narrator was little suspicious about Mrs. Darling taking away their things to keep it safe in Mrs. Darling's house. She even expresses this discontentment to her mother. But her mother was more worried about Mrs. Darling getting hurt by carrying heavy luggages from their home to Mrs. Darling's house. The narrator also recalled another incident when she had met Mrs. Darling for an instant. She was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat at that time. Narrator's mother, who is called as Mrs. S in the story, had introduced narrator to Mrs. Darling. After Mrs. Darling had left their house with more of their household items, her mother had asked her to remember the address of Mrs. Darling, that is Marconi Street, number 46. Her mother had insisted on the daughter to remember this address because she thought that after the Holocaust, most of them would be dead. So this was narrator's first meeting with Mrs. Darling after the war, as her mother had imagined. All of their family members had passed away and now only the narrator had survived the war. As her mother's wish or demand, the narrator had now returned back to Mrs. Darling's house to collect the belongings of her family.